Okay, good afternoon. Our group decided to conduct our CSR team video project on Nike, and we'll specifically be focusing on the complex issues surrounding forced labor and its global supply chain. This presentation was prepared by myself, Helen Lee, Janet Kelly, and Mitchell Hubbard, and is based on the latest research that we found, which includes Nike's FY23 impact report and various investigative findings. With that, next slide. So Nike was a brief history here, a short history. Nike was originally founded in 1964 as Blue Ribbon Sports. They rebranded in 1978 to Nike. And they're currently headquartered in Beaverton, Oregon. 1990, just another kind of top line. They introduced their "Just Do It" campaign, which, as we all know, has become one of the most iconic phrases in the industry. Where we'll focus the bulk of our presentation today is in this 1990s and 2000s and really present day, but with respect to their forced labor. Nike has faced historically criticism over labor practices in factories, particularly in Asia, where there's been several reports of unsafe conditions and low wages. And that, like I said, that scrutiny over its conditions and specifically in its Chinese-based supply chain remains today. Despite that, present day, they're valued at $92.1 billion, and they are the world's largest supplier of athletic shoes and apparel. Next slide.
Oops. Sorry about that.
So through our research and in the FY23 impact report, we kind of boiled down the ethical principles that Nike embodies to four specific ethical principles guided by kind of a foundational framework. So that foundational framework that we're talking about is people, planet, play. There in the center, with the four main ethical principles of common good, rights-based approach, utilitarianism, and universalism as kind of those four like foundational ethical principles that surround that framework. They're really key on embracing diversity and promoting inclusivity. They despite saying they have commitments to fair labor standards, they still have faced scrutiny there. And they're really focused on their broad environmental and social impact goals, trying to create that greatest good for the greatest number. Next slide. And what's it like to work at Nike? So a couple top line bullets here. They embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion. Their inclusivity concept specifically is like everyone that has a body is an athlete, making it as wide reaching of an organization as possible. They're very high energy, innovative, and team driven. And they do invest actively in employee growth and community engagement. And with that, I will turn it over to my next group member.
Yeah, so what we're going to be going over is the forced labor in the global south. Next slide, please. And the main issue is regarding Nike's continued contracts with these global suppliers that are reported to use forced labor. And forced labor generally refers to overworked, underpaid employees and the general treatment and expectations of those employees. Now, we say the global south, but specifically these reports are coming from Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. And as John mentioned, Nike is not new to this type of criticism. It dates back to the 1990s and their use of child labor. This has now since shifted, and now Nike is consistently being criticized for their use of forced labor. Next slide, please. So these garments are, one, being overworked. They literally work more than 6 hours a week, often skipping breaks, working through holidays, and oftentimes pulling overnight shifts. And two, they're underpaid. Workers barely make minimum wage, and around 1% make 1.96 of the times the minimum wage. And a majority of the workers struggle to get by every day and struggle to provide for their families. In addition to this, garment workers experience poor treatment and distress. They're often subject to arbitrary abuse and unrealistic goals. They fear termination and retaliation trying to fulfill these goals. And due to all of the long work hours, poor sleep, and food insecurity, workers often experience poor health conditions, and they also have unpaid wages due to unexpectedly terminated contracts with 290. Next slide, please. Situation are the workers back the guard and urgency, making them dependent stakeholders. The factory owners have high power and urgency, but low legitimacy, making them dangerous stakeholders. And Nike has high power and high legitimacy, making them dominant stakeholders. Investors and organizations with apparel deals, they are only high in economic power, making them dominant stakeholders. Next slide, please. As for the key non-market stakeholders, we have activist groups. They are high in legitimacy and urgency, and they fall between dominant and definitive stakeholders depending on how effectively they can make waves towards reaching a solution. Next, we have student protesters on university campuses. I wanted to specifically mention them. Oh, sorry, previous slide. I wanted to specifically mention them as they are a niche group of stakeholders. They do not have any power, and they have moderate legitimacy and urgency, but they can be one of the most active stakeholders depending on the culture of the campus. Due to this, they're categorized as demanding stakeholders. And our last key non-market stakeholder is each respective country government. They have the power to enforce change, and they also have a legitimate claim to make those changes. But in this specific case, the governments are not enforcing regulation. Due to this, they are categorized as dominant stakeholders. Next slide, please. And there are many other stakeholders related to this issue, but they're not recognized as key stakeholders. Some of these include employees, ambassadors, competitor brands, and residents of each respective countries. Next slide, and I'll pass it over to Mitch.
So what was the impact of Nike? Overall on Nike practices in terms of ethical and social responsibility conduct were four-pronged. The supply chain audit, transparency, disclosure of suppliers, cooperation with U.S. lawmakers to eliminate forced labor, and ethical sourcing commitment. So overall, Nike had to bolster their supply chain, make it more transparent. They had to work with lawmakers to make it more transparent and comply with certain new laws that were being introduced to make the supply chain more transparent throughout the whole process. And ethical sourcing commitment, they had to make certain commitments in writing to prove that they were sourcing from ethical suppliers. So things basically have changed. Nike faced a reputational damage, media scrutiny, consumer backlash, and legal risk. And the external pressures forced the company to act to protect its brand and comply with regulations, but it was largely seen as reactive and insincere. Next slide, please. There were other impacts on Nike and other activities. We focus on 5: marketing, communication, investor relations, HR, reputational management, and R&D. The impact on each of these respectively, marketing and communication, they had to do a lot of crisis communication to the public to reassure that followers, investors, and other end customers were basically reassured that the sourcing of materials was from ethical vendors and suppliers. Finance and investor relations, basically investors needed to be reassured. HR management, internal morale was at stake. So a lot of the communication that went out there was to bolster their moral messaging. The reputational management, it was seen as hypocritical messaging, so it was challenged at the customer level, and research and development. They were forced to rethink their sourcing strategy, as I mentioned before, revamping their supply chain at many different levels. Next slide, please. And lastly, we'll focus on the environmental factors. Forced labor crisis was influenced by multiple layers of the business environment, those being macro, meso, and micro. The macro being the broad external level, meso being the industry level, and micro being those closely internal. The macro factors had certain consequences, including government scrutiny and public backlash. The meso consequences were they were exposed by non-government organizations, and competitors forced them to revisit their sourcing, as I mentioned before. And then the micro, they were forced to cut ties with certain suppliers. They had to do damage control to appease employees, and then strengthen their corporate responsibility to retain customers. With that, I'll turn it over to Janet.
Thanks, Mitch. The Nike child labor crisis was a significant challenge for the company, and its resolution was influenced by several corporate cultural factors. A cultural factor that was a challenge is the emphasis on cost minimization and profit maximization. Nike's early business strategy was built around a lean, outsourced manufacturing model, which led to subcontractors resorting to underpaying workers in primarily the Asian countries. This is when supply chain transparency was minimal. In summary, they were overlooking ethical concerns in the pursuit of efficiency. Another cultural factor that was a challenge is the lack of internal accountability for supply chain ethics. There was a cultural void regarding internal accountability for ethical labor because of their large supply chain. No one at Nike was truly responsible for ensuring child labor wasn't happening in distant factories. Some factors that helped in the resolution was Nike came forward and made a true commitment to transparency and accountability. They increased factory audits, they raised the minimum wage of workers, they developed a responsible sourcing program with rigorous supplier assessments, and enforced a strict supplier code of conduct aligned with international labor standards. They also became the first company in their industry to publish a complete list of their contract factories in their 2005 Corporate Social Responsibility, or CSR, report, which was a significant step towards transparency. The company learned from its mistakes, adapted its strategies, and developed new approaches to supply chain management and worker welfare. Now we ask what other ethical principles would have been better for Nike that we've learned in our class. Stakeholder theory is one that comes to mind. It would have encouraged Nike to proactively consider the well-being of factory workers, even if these were subcontractors. It would have ensured a broader consideration of all affected parties from the beginning, moving beyond a narrow focus on shareholder profit. Another ethical principle that we've talked pretty extensively about is universalism, which has been displayed throughout our discussion, is a key ethical theory. If there were clear ethical boundaries, child labor would be erased and humane working conditions would be evident. Also, the response to crisis would be proactive and principle-driven rather than reactive. In conclusion, Nike's journey highlights the power of stakeholder engagement and evolving expectations for global corporations. While they've made strides in embedding ethical considerations, their true commitment hinges on consistent, transparent action to address ongoing issues, empower their workforce, and lead the industry towards a more sustainable and equitable future. For a company as influential as Nike, just doing it ethically demands steadfast dedication and a willingness to confront difficult realities.